Hello, this is Sorian again, and I've got another scripted video for you. Today's title is How the Channeled Scablands Disproves Young Earth Creationism. This is a story of a man named J. Harlan Bretz. This is the story of how science works. That is, evidence speaks for itself and will always triumph over preconceptions and long-held beliefs, even if there's some kicking and screaming along the way. The Channeled Scablands is one of the strangest areas on Earth. Some of the formations there are completely unique. In the early 20th century, most prominent scientists were decidedly uniformitarian in their thinking. That is, they believed that the regular observed processes of usual geographic events acting over the vast periods of time were able to explain most, if not all, of the observed geologic record. Bretz began his field research in the Scablands in 1922. He continued these summer outings over the course of 7 years, traveling largely by foot. What he saw was truly remarkable. For example, the cliffs of the Dry Falls are 3.5 miles wide and drop some 400 to 600 vertical feet. By comparison, Niagara Falls is only a measly 1.5 miles wide and drops just 165 vertical feet. Bretz took note of the very steep sides of the channels and the relatively straight pathways, as well as the presence of very large gravel bars deposited by water. The evidence spoke clearly. The Channeled Scablands was formed by massive catastrophic water flows. No slow processes could explain all of what was seen. He presented his observations to the USGS first in 1923 without analysis, because he knew the idea of catastrophic formation would be seen as biblical and not scientific. In a second paper, Bretz presented the analysis and conclusion of catastrophic formation. Of course, there was no acceptance of his ideas at all. One of the most damning arguments against it is that there was no way to explain the source of so much water. However, there was a source. Another geologist, Joseph T. Pardee, had a source, Glacial Lake Missoula. If you visit Missoula, Montana today, you find a nice, quiet little town. However, surrounding it on the hills is clear evidence of a massive lake, at least 2,000 feet deep, covering some 3,000 square miles. Pardee's work in Montana clearly showed how the lake was contained by glaciers and emptied very quickly when the glaciers failed, maybe in as little as 48 hours. And all that water was pointing straight to the Channeled Scablands. Little by little, the ideas of Bretz was accepted over the years as he continued his work. Eventually his hypothesis was confirmed with bench flow and hydrodynamic work in the 1970s. The amount of water and forces involved are almost beyond comprehension. When the glacial failed, 500 cubic miles of water rushed out at 50 to 60 miles per hour. By comparison, Mount St. Helens ejected less than 1 cubic mile of itself in 1980 when it lost 1,300 feet of altitude. The flow of the flood would be roughly 10 times that of all the rivers on Earth today combined. The work on the Scablands continues. The latest findings show not one flood, but several massive floods over the course of 20,000 years. While this is interesting information, how does all this disprove young Earth? 2 ways. First, a common argument against current theories is that evidence requires interpretation. You can read this for yourself on Answers in Genesis. They argue that scientists come from an old Earth evolutionary preconception and thus miss the real evidence, which is for creation. The work of Bretz clearly shows that at least some of the time the evidence is clear and not in need of any interpretation at all. Second, another common argument is that formations like the Grand Canyon were formed by the Great Flood, that is, catastrophically. However, there is clearly a completely different result when slow erosion takes place versus catastrophe. All you have to do is look at the Grand Canyon and look at the Channeled Scablands, and you know they could not have been formed the same way. If a biblical flood were true, most valleys would look like the Scablands. They do not, and thus could not have been formed by massive flooding, only through slow erosion. Nova recently had a show on called Mystery of the Great Flood about all this, where some of this information comes from, and some more information comes from this website, which I will link here, which happens to be a creationist website of all things. Oh, the irony. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you can take these lessons to heart. Science works. The Bible does not. Thank you very much.